You should have my kid ASAP. Even if it comes from someone I've cut ties with, it's not pleasing at all. In fact, it's disgusting. Besides, it was Nick who filed for divorce on his own. Thinking it's too late for him to act so entitled, I remained silent, which somehow made Nick laugh out loud under some misunderstanding. You just can't do without me, huh? What? I'm already remarried though? What? I couldn't help but laugh at Nick's bewildered voice. I never thought you were such a slut. His words don't affect me at all. I simply told him, don't contact me ever again, and hung up the phone without waiting for his response. Christina, what happened? Actually, when I told Scott about the phone call, he immediately agreed to take care of it. It seems there was another call from someone else, and they planned to handle it together. Looking forward to the retribution against those two who hurt me, I started making tea. My name is Christina Owen. I'm a 35-year-old housewife. I remarried about 5 years after divorcing my ex-husband. Now, I'm a mother of 1 child. Since my marriage life with my ex-husband was the worst, I feel very happy now. I met my ex-husband, Nick, at the reception of a trading company where he approached me, and we started dating. Many around me were getting arranged marriages, but my parents wanted me, their only daughter, to have a love marriage and supported my relationship with Nick. After receiving my parents' approval, we got engaged quickly. And about a year into our relationship, we registered our marriage. Nick was somewhat authoritarian but generally kind, and our marriage was going well. However, about 6 months after registering our marriage, Nick's attitude changed completely. Hey, food. What? I was confused by his sudden demand. Just yesterday, it was, what's for dinner, or what should we eat for dinner? As I wondered how to respond, Nick raised his voice in irritation. I'm hungry. Hurry up and serve the food. Huh, but I haven't even started yet. Useless woman. Forget it. Where are you going? Ignoring me, he put on his shoes and left swiftly. I stared blankly at the door he slammed shut. Did I do something wrong? I tried to recall recent events, but couldn't understand why. Eventually, Nick returned the next morning, immediately took a shower upon arrival, and secluded himself in the bedroom. It was actually my birthday that day, and we had plans to go out for a meal. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything about it and started doing housework instead. Hey. The vacuum cleaner is too loud. Are you doing this on purpose? No, it's just that since we're not going out today, I thought I'd clean up. It's your fault we're not going out. I have a headache, keep it down. I'm sorry. Looking back, it was clearly Nick who was in the wrong, but at that time, I was convinced that I had upset him and was to blame. And as Nick realized this, he became even more tyrannical. This food is terrible, make it again. What? You got a problem with that? No, not at all. Sorry. Being criticized for every meal and cleaning, I was exhausted. Yet, I loved Nick and believed he would become kind again. That's why I strained myself every day to do the housework. But that wasn't good. You're like a mannequin, so boring. One day, Nick spat that out and left. When he returned, he proudly declared to me, I cheated on you. Why? Because you don't satisfy me. Got a problem with that? But we're married. Nick glared at me upon hearing my words. Then, he started yelling with a face like a demon. You got a problem with what I do. It's not that, but. It's not, but. Don't you even know to honor your husband? Nick slammed his hand against the wall forcefully. Intimidated by Nick, who was 7 inches taller than me, I completely shrank back. Then, suddenly, Nick spoke to me in a soothing voice. I don't want to do this either. If only you tried harder. Right. I understand, I'll try harder. That's right. A husband's affair is because of the wife's failure. Hearing that made it feel true, and I nodded in agreement. Since then, Nick would easily lash out at things whenever he was displeased. And afterwards, he would always explain it to me in a soothing voice. I'm doing this for you. I was completely trapped by Nick's words, blaming myself for everything and unable to escape from this cycle of self-blame. Then, one day, Nick brought home a young woman. She's pregnant with my child, so I'll be living with her from today. What do you mean? As I asked, confused, the woman answered with a triumphant look. That means since I'm pregnant with Nick's child, you're no longer needed. I, Isabella, married Nick, and I'll be living here from today. Suddenly being told she would live here, I couldn't comprehend. Pregnant? Married? All these things came at me at once, and I was completely confused. I am the one married to Nick. We are not divorced. So why does this woman claim to be married to Nick? To this, Nick began to loudly explain. I'm tired of you, and I've already filed for divorce. Be thankful to Isabella for writing it on your behalf. Thankful. What should I do about the divorce? I don't care, though I'll keep you as a maid if you want. Nick said, smirking. At that moment, I finally woke up. That's fine. I'll leave by today. Going back to your parents? Make sure you say it was all your fault, okay? No, I'll tell everything exactly as it happened. Hey, wait. Ignoring Nick's attempts to stop me, I took only my belongings and left the house. When I arrived at my parents' house, they were shocked and asked me what happened. I told them everything without holding back. My parents listened to the end and were angry with me. Together, we went to a lawyer at my father's company and demanded compensation from Nick and Isabella. Of course, both Nick and Isabella refused. But since Nick had filed for divorce on his own and then remarried, and with a baby on the way, they couldn't escape the situation. In the end, we demanded $50,000 from Nick and $40,000 from Isabella. They both paid in full, which meant they probably had to borrow the money. But that was none of my concern. I started working again on my own. At first, I considered going back to being an office worker, but since I enjoyed housekeeping, I started taking housekeeping jobs privately, thanks to my parents' connections. Initially, I had 1 or 2 clients, but thanks to word of mouth, I started getting requests every day. One of my clients was Scott Owen. He was a wealthy man who traveled the world alone, delivering supplies to children and teaching them. He was rarely home, only a few times a month. So he gave me the keys to his house and asked me to clean. I initially refused, but after being repeatedly asked by someone referred through an acquaintance, I agreed to clean his house a few times a month. Eventually, Scott asked me to clean even when he was in the US. Scott, who prefers simplicity, turned out to have a lot in common with me, and we often had engaging conversations. After about 2 years of this lifestyle, Scott said something I hadn't expected. I've fallen for you, Christina. Would you consider dating me with marriage in mind? Excuse me. Scott was handsome and smart, so I thought there must be better women out there for him. That's why I initially refused. However, Scott didn't give up and kept asking me out on dates. I still remember how happy he looked when I accepted for the first time. Eventually, I went on more dates with Scott, and after the 4th date, when he formally confessed, I agreed to start dating him. He quickly introduced me to his parents and openly declared that we were dating with marriage in mind. My in-laws were very kind people who didn't mind that I was divorced and treated me well. About a year into our relationship, we got married. Then, 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant with our first child. Our marriage life was so smooth and peaceful that I decided to quit my job, albeit reluctantly, and focus solely on housekeeping at home. Scott, who was already capable of doing household chores, often helped me. Moreover, because we were expecting a child, Scott decided to stay in the US. However, he wanted to continue his activities. So he established an organization and became its president. He incorporated the organization and set up a company in the US to support children overseas. The happiness of you and our baby is my top priority. Scott always said that, and he also treated my parents with great care. I felt incredibly happy every day, something I couldn't have imagined during my marriage with Nick. Now that the compensation payments from both of them were completed, I rarely thought about them, but one day, I received an anonymous call on my phone. Scott was not home at the time, so I initially didn't answer. But the persistent ringing forced me to pick up. Hello. Christina? Who is this? It's me. You haven't forgotten about me, have you? I felt a chill down my spine at his tone. Unbelievable. Why would he call now? I can't understand the reason. Nick? That's right. Good old Christina. I wasn't pleased at all to be praised like that. I wanted to end the call quickly and urged him to get to the point. What can I do for you? You're being so formal. Nick cheerfully shared his recent happenings. However, none of it mattered to me. This has nothing to do with me, right? Don't be like that. You've reflected by now, haven't you? Reflected? I repeated myself, utterly baffled by the conversation. Just then, Scott came home. I gave him a look. At that moment, on the other end of the phone, Nick, sounding pleased with himself, finally got to the point. So, if you've reflected, I'll take you back. Take me back? You should have my kid ASAP. Hearing this from someone I've already severed ties with does not please me at all. In fact, it's disgusting. Besides, it was Nick who filed for divorce on his own initiative. Thinking how presumptuous he was being, I stayed silent, which made Nick laugh loudly under some misapprehension. You just can't manage without me, can you? What? I've already remarried though? What? I couldn't help but laugh at Nick's bewildered voice. I never thought you were such a slut. His words don't affect me at all. I simply told him, don't contact me ever again, and hung up the phone without waiting for his reply. Christina, what's wrong? Actually, when I told Scott about the phone call, he immediately agreed to handle it. It seems there was another call from someone else, and they planned to deal with it together. Looking forward to the retribution against those two who hurt me, I started making tea. A few days later, our lawyer came to visit. He had helped with the divorce and now represents not only my father's company but also Scott's. When I told him about what had happened, he agreed to take immediate action. While discussing with Scott and the lawyer, my phone rang. I exchanged looks with the two of them and placed my smartphone on the table, answering the call on speaker. Christina. Yesterday was so sudden, I got confused. But you can't sulk and lie. You're not really remarried, because I'm still here. His selfish interpretation made me sigh. I felt embarrassed to have ever liked such a man. Sensing how I felt, Scott chuckled and took over the call. It's no lie. I am Christina's current husband. Huh? What are you talking about? Christina, you should just call the police on this deluded guy. It's neither a misunderstanding nor a joke. We are truly married. We've registered our marriage. Scott spoke calmly throughout, while Nick became increasingly irritated. To him, I made my stance clear. What he's saying is true. I'm remarried. So, please don't contact me anymore. So you're sulking? Someone told you to say that? No. If you want, our lawyer here can explain it to you. As soon as I mentioned the lawyer, Nick clicked his tongue in annoyance over the phone. Then, he tried to command me with a frustrated voice. Then just divorce him and come back. I'll forgive you if you apologize properly. I'll come to pick you up tomorrow. Nick's utter lack of understanding gave me a headache. Then, the lawyer spoke up calmly. Nick, you do realize there's a restraining order against you approaching Christina, right? Any contact would immediately result in damages. What? That's expired, right? That's not how it works. It's still very much in effect. Finally, the lawyer's words seemed to cut Nick's momentum. However, Nick then tried a softer approach to persuade me. Come on, Christina. You'd be happier with me, wouldn't you? Is it really completely out of the question? It's impossible. Because, you see, I have a child now. What? A child. Nick seemed to be shocked and fell silent on the phone. Scott then declared, adding insult to injury. I can make Christina happier than you ever could with your selfish, domineering ways. We will never divorce, and she will never return to you. I nodded in agreement and held Scott's hand. Then, while Nick remained silent, I hung up the phone. For about 2 weeks, there were no calls from Nick. Just when I thought he had given up and felt a sigh of relief. One day, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wonder who it is. I went to the intercom and was shocked. There were Nick and his affair partner, Isabella. I had heard rumors that they had split, but it seemed they were still connected. While pressing the record button on my smartphone, I responded. You're supposed to stay away. If you have money, return the compensation. 5 years can change a person, I thought naively, but hearing Isabella's words. It seemed they had come to our house with money in mind. My having money and returning compensation to you don't really connect. It's the same. You just want money. Or no, that's not quite. Why are they so arrogant when they were the ones in the wrong for cheating? I was perplexed. Then Isabella began to explain her situation unasked. I'm engaged. To a manager at my company, a really nice guy. I can't tell him about my debt. You understand, right? Congratulations on your engagement. But what does that have to do with the compensation? I genuinely didn't understand, but it seemed my attitude only infuriated Isabella further. She started getting angry even through the intercom. That's why. Just return the money for the debt, and we'll call it even. You're not struggling for money, are you? I heard you're rich. Isabella's hysterical shouting made me fear. Although they couldn't enter due to the autolock. I wondered what I would do if they tried to force their way in through a window. As I was thinking this, Isabella screamed even louder. And how did you even get such a handsome man? He suits me better, so give him to me. I'm sorry, but a husband isn't something that can be given. I know that much. Right after my reply, Isabella retorted, and Nick burst out laughing behind her. It might have been funny, but it was rude. Then, Isabella turned her anger towards Nick. It's your fault for not having money in the first place. Nick retorted, annoyed. You lied about being pregnant. That was a misunderstanding. What? You were so sure of yourself. The two of them completely forgot my presence and started arguing. So, the pregnancy was a lie. I felt as if a thorn in my heart had been slightly removed. Just then, a police officer appeared on the intercom screen. This is nothing. No, officer, this is just a small argument. They started making excuses, but the police officer didn't buy it and took them away. I collapsed at the intercom. Sigh. I'm just glad they didn't get in. Are you all right? It turned out that Scott was the one who had called the police. Actually, I had contacted Scott before answering the intercom. He had told me to record the conversation and that he would be home as soon as possible. Sorry for bothering you when you're busy, and thank you. Your safety is the top priority, don't worry about it. I felt reassured by Scott's dependable presence. I was truly glad I had remarried him. I felt this from the bottom of my heart. Since the lawyer had informed the police about the restraining order, Nick and Isabella were thoroughly reprimanded. However, now the lawyer started receiving daily calls demanding the return of the money. It seems we need to settle this once and for all. After receiving a call from the lawyer, Scott and I decided to confront Nick and Isabella directly. When we relayed through the lawyer that we wanted to meet, Nick and Isabella happily agreed, probably thinking they were going to get money. We prepared thoroughly and awaited the day of the showdown. On the day, my parents also came, having been informed beforehand. Upon arriving at the designated location, Nick and Isabella were already there, along with my former in-laws. My former in-laws glared at me as soon as they saw me. Thank you all for gathering today. Let's begin the discussion. At my signal, everyone looked at me. I placed 2 papers on the table. They were invoices for the penalty due to violating the restraining order. Nick and Isabella's eyes widened upon seeing them. What's this amount? We can't possibly pay this. The paper stated a penalty of $30,000 each. Nick and Isabella started complaining, and then my former mother-in-law spoke up. Aren't you getting a bit ahead of yourself, Christina? Excuse me? I was confused by her question, and she laughed mockingly before starting to speak. We've already paid the compensation for the affair. Demanding more money. I thought wealthy people were more magnanimous. But you seem quite petty. Petty, you say? She was essentially saying to drop the current claim. However, I had no intention of doing that. While we might not be struggling financially, this was a penalty for not adhering to an agreement. Nick and Isabella had a clear obligation to pay. I explained this to my former mother-in-law, but she was not convinced. You were once our daughter-in-law, after all. To make such a fuss. I can't imagine doing that. Nick and Isabella nodded in agreement with her, their opinions aligning, making them oddly bold. I sighed and played the recording from the other day. My former mother-in-law's face turned red upon hearing it. Scott then pointed it out. Oh, are you embarrassed? A man almost in his 40s. Getting into trouble with the police in front of his ex-wife's house. I'd be too ashamed to show my face if I were you. My former mother-in-law glared at Scott but seemed unable to come up with a comeback. Grinding her teeth in frustration. I felt I had to say something and opened my mouth. Well, it's good nothing was damaged. It would have been quite serious if something like a statue had been broken. That cost about $800,000, after all. $800,000. My former mother-in-law turned pale at my words. Nick and Isabella were gaping. That's when I finally realized. I realized I had never mentioned my parents' assets to Nick. You know, my parents' total assets are around $29 million. So, it's not a big deal, but if it came to compensation, Nick and Isabella would really struggle. $29 million. You're kidding, right? Why would I need to lie? Seeing my serious demeanor, Nick, realizing I was telling the truth, hung his head, pale-faced. Isabella, who had been watching silently, suddenly brightened up and turned to Scott. Then, Scott, you must be quite wealthy too, aren't you? What? Scott showed clear disdain, but Isabella, undeterred, continued. Indeed, Scott's total assets were similar to my parents'. However, that had nothing to do with the current discussion. So, why don't you divorce such a demanding wife and marry me instead? I'm pretty, and I'd look good in a dress. Isabella was indeed young and beautiful, something to be envious of. However, Scott looked at her coldly. No matter how beautiful you are, I will not be swayed. My wife is the most beautiful and dear to me in the world. It was somewhat embarrassing to be praised like that in front of everyone. As I blushed, Isabella glared at me resentfully. Then, I remembered something and shared it with Isabella. By the way, I met an acquaintance of Scott's recently. Who happens to be the president of your company, Isabella. When he asked about you, I mentioned that you were Nick's remarried partner but soon divorced. What did you say to him? I just told him the truth, that you were once married to my ex-husband, but divorced shortly after. Isabella's eyes widened, and then she burst into tears. I was just being honest, yet I felt the need to add one more piece of advice. Isabella, I heard you've been unfaithful again. That's not good. You should also be honest about your marital history, or you won't be able to build trust with your partner. What have you done? I merely shared the truth. I replied with a smile. When Nick brought Isabella into my life, I was deeply hurt. This little payback seemed fair. Just then, Scott's phone rang. He answered and after a brief conversation, hung up and addressed Isabella. I just got a call from the president, asking to inform you that your engagement with his son is off. No. No. Isabella screamed and collapsed onto the table. It was a pitiful scene, but it didn't really concern me. We look forward to your payment, then. At that moment, my former mother-in-law pressed on. Because of you, Nick will be in debt again. Don't you feel bad? Yeah. Don't you feel any guilt? I pondered for a moment. Guilt? I had simply done what was necessary. Emotion didn't really come into it. Then, I remembered something else I hadn't mentioned. Oh, right. Nick's company was bought by my husband's company. He'll be attending the next audit report meeting. Please be prepared. That can't be true. I don't lie, you know? Right? I looked to Scott for confirmation, and he nodded. Seeing this, Nick slumped, defeated, unable to say another word. However, my former mother-in-law still tried to argue. At that moment, my former father-in-law, who had been silent, spoke up. Christina, I'm truly sorry. Please let me apologize on behalf of the two of them. He said this and apologized. I was taken aback by the former father-in-law's gesture. Throughout my marriage, he had always been critical of Nick's actions and the former mother-in-law's snide remarks. He was the one who insisted that the compensation be paid in full, even if it meant taking on debt. Thus, I harbored no ill feelings towards him. Please, don't apologize. Let me apologize. It's the least I can do. As he apologized, my former mother-in-law looked on in disbelief. I'll make sure the compensation is paid in full, even if it means taking on more debt. And, I'm divorcing your mother. Divorce. Why? I can't stand your lack of common sense anymore. My former mother-in-law turned pale and clung to him, but his decision was firm. And she eventually hung her head in defeat, just like Nick. Handle your divorce on your own. We just need the payment agreement signed. Understood. Now, both of you, sign it quickly. Under the former father-in-law's stern voice, Nick and Isabella reluctantly signed the payment agreement. My parents, Scott, and I confirmed the signatures before standing up to leave. Just before exiting, my parents spoke up, having listened quietly until then. Wasn't irreconcilable differences the reason for your divorce? Indeed, our values couldn't be more different. So, let's not have any further involvement, please. Our daughter, who was hurt by Nick, is now very happy. If anyone intends to disrupt this happiness, be prepared. Touched by my parents' love, I felt tears welling up. Scott, holding my hand, gave me a reassuring smile. We left the rest to my former father-in-law and departed. Afterward, the restraining order fines were successfully deposited. I wondered how they managed to come up with the money, but it didn't really matter. It seems Nick got fired from his job following an audit. Rumors suggest his dismissal was due to inappropriate behavior with female colleagues during work hours, slacking off, and generally being incompetent. Despite appearing competent at work during our marriage, it turns out he had been dumping his responsibilities on his juniors, who eventually got promoted, leaving him sidelined. As a result, he was the first to be recommended for early retirement once his performance evaluations turned poor. Nick apparently accepted the early retirement, but his severance pay was swallowed up by debt repayment, forcing him to look for another job, according to rumors. However, companies in the same industry were reluctant to hire him, and he ended up working part-time at a store to make ends meet. Isabella's engagement was indeed broken off, and further affairs came to light, leading to more compensation demands. Unable to cover the compensation payments to me and her fiancé, Isabella ended up quitting her job to work in a nightclub. Known for leveraging her femininity, I wondered if she would continue to do so. However, it turns out that at 28, she's already considered old in the nightclub scene, where she hardly makes any money due to the lack of customers, forcing her to take a part-time job during the day. While part of me feels sorry for her as a fellow woman, I also believe it's a case of reaping what one sows. My former father-in-law did indeed go through with the divorce and came over to greet me once. He wished me happiness, and I was able to express my gratitude. He's now returned to his family home and is dedicating himself to farming, hoping he stays healthy and active for as long as possible. As for my former mother-in-law, after the divorce, she moved in with Nick. Having never worked a day in her life, Nick is now responsible for all living expenses. My former father-in-law mentioned that she is quite the spendthrift, and the household is often filled with her shouting, painting a rather tumultuous picture of their daily life. I recently gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Scott is completely smitten and has been a great help, allowing me to rest properly. He even took paternity leave, making our day-to-day life much easier. Our discussions about future plans, including travel, fill me with joy. My parents are absolutely smitten with their first grandchild, bringing new toys with each visit. Recently, the abundance of toys led us to remodel a room into a toy room. Scott and I have been discussing taking a trip abroad once our child is a bit older. With each day filled with excitement for the bright future ahead, I truly feel like the luckiest person. Christina, it's time for feeding. Coming. Today, since Scott is taking care of everything except nursing, I've been able to enjoy some reading time. After drinking some decaffeinated tea, I got up and headed to the living room. There, I found our child crying while arched back like a shrimp. And Scott, despite being a bit overwhelmed, had a happy expression on his face. "What are you laughing at?" "Oh, nothing." Saying that, I took our child from Scott and began to nurse. There's this strange feeling that this happiness will continue on forever. It's bright outside. Once nursing is finished, let's go for a walk, just the three of us. I shared this thought with Scott and smiled.